I think he's going to have all sorts of regrets about how he's attempted to prosecute this war so far. I think it's clear that he was anticipating a pretty simple, a pretty straightforward takeover, certainly of the Donbass region, as he'd seen in Crimea back in 2014. And we've seen kind of mistake after mistake, partly due to long-standing issues, I think, that are related to just how long he's been at the head of this authoritarian regime, which make it much harder, I would say, to reliably judge or what's going on in the ground, to trust the information that he's getting, and to make those strategic decisions. So I think looking back, he can see multiple mistakes being made. But the way the system is, I think we're going to see many more of the similar kind of mistakes going forward in the conflict.
Jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny once accused Putin of building a brittle system of incompetent sycophants. How does his inner circle now compare to what it was in previous years?
I think that Navalny quote is a very insightful one. I think in order to do well at all in Russia's current system, you have to be able to cozy up to power. But the other side of that is for Putin to remain in power and for him to remain in a strong position in power, he has to balance the interests of various, often competing elite groups. And that's one of the difficulties he has now also in going forward with the war, because the different groups, there's so much infighting amongst them. We've already seen a process of attempting to scapegoat for why the war's going so wrong. So a lot of the newly installed administrations in these newly annexed regions, they've already come out criticising the Ministry of Defence. Now, so far, there's still a big taboo on directly criticising Putin. So we're seeing people like Defence Minister Shoigu being criticised, and the Ministry of Defence in general, the generals in the army being criticised because they must have given Putin poor intelligence prior to this operation commencing. And there's a whole host of these attempts to spread the blame, I think, that haven't really reflected directly on Putin, certainly not amongst that inner circle, certainly not amongst anyone with any sort of proximity to power so far.
Just on that, how has the Ukraine invasion reshaped who Putin surrounds himself with? Are those in the Kremlin who are more sceptical of Russia's chances in Ukraine able to actually voice their scepticism?
No, not really. There are certain elements of critique that are being voiced, but never the overall project. You know, that's just a step too far. And I think to survive in Russia's political system, political actors, journalists as well, they have to learn where that line is, and they've very well trained themselves over the years to know where that line is. So, as I mentioned, we're seeing some criticisms of how the war is being conducted, but never criticisms of the war as a whole, never criticisms that reflect directly on Putin himself. And that's partly because it's just a known fact that Putin wants to hear certain things, and the people who are able to provide those lines to him are more likely to get access. Now, obviously, when you're attempting to wage a military operation, you actually need reliable information rather than information that you want to hear. And that's one of the reasons that we're seeing so many difficulties now, because as far as this invasion has continued, we are still seeing failures in intelligence on the Russian side. Obviously, Russia is relying primarily on its own intelligence, and that entire system is undermined by this kind of nepotistic system that Putin has built up. And so it's quite hard to break through that, I would say, to have a more reliable picture of what's going on the ground for him.
What about ordinary Russians? How do they feel about some of these recent strategic failures?
You have to remember that for ordinary Russians, the type of information that they're getting is highly filtered, highly restricted. So up until relatively recently, just I think for self-preservation reasons, the majority of Russian people would prefer to pretend that this wasn't happening. They would maybe toe the official line in public. They certainly wouldn't respond to a survey saying that they were against the war or against Putin, for example. But I don't think there was a groundswell of support for it. There's a very small contingent of hard rightists who are pro-war in a real sense. The majority of people know that it's kind of being done regardless. Now, since the mobilization was announced, obviously this war becomes something that affects more of the Russian population, people who could have just avoided it before or pretended it wasn't happening, and that can't go ahead now. So we are seeing much more public dissent being voiced. And that's particularly in a lot of Russia's ethnically titular republics, so places where it's not majority ethnic Russian but majority other ethnicities. These are places that have got, low investment, terrible infrastructure, very poor employment opportunities, and also extremely high rates of mobilization. These are people who are being disproportionately sent to the front, and we've seen a real backlash in those regions particularly. We're seeing it also now in the bigger population centres like Moscow and St. Petersburg, now that more people who thought they could get on with their lives in a comfortable fashion are finding that that's just not plausible anymore.
So many have suggested that Putin pulling troops out of Ukraine immediately may be Russia's best strategically favourable move. But how likely is Putin to consider a move like that?
Well, I think we need to bear in mind that so far, Russia has not committed to its most strategically favourable move at multiple points as this war has progressed. Decisions in the Kremlin are not being made purely on the basis of strategy. They're being made partly on the basis of what's fitting for the regime. And I think Putin has been in power so long at the head of this autocratic regime that he has come to conflate his own interests and the interests of maintaining his regime with the interests of the state. So those decisions are not being made as another state perhaps might, but they're being made with those dual considerations. And this is part of the reason that a lot of strategic mistakes have been made. If we go right back to the beginning of the war, Putin had kind of lost the imagination to even believe that a multimillionaire like Zelensky would actually stay and fight in the interests of his state rather than fleeing in his own personal interests. So multiple times the strategic calculus has been very much off because there are too many personal and regime considerations in there. And I don't think that's going to just flip now. So I don't think we should be looking at the most likely, the most strategically plausible outcome. We've got to look at the most realistic outcomes. And right now, I think it would be far too politically dangerous for Putin to just pull those troops because it would entail admitting that the whole strategy was wrong.
Dr. Precious Chatterje-Doody, we always appreciate your analysis. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.